The exact origins of ornithischians remain somewhat enigmatic due to the incomplete and fragmentary nature of the earliest fossil records. This has made it challenging to identify the most basal members of the clade. Nonetheless, significant scientific strides have been made in understanding their early evolution. Eocursor was a lightly built bipedal dinosaur with an estimated length of about 1 meter. The general aspect of the animal resembles that of the early Jurassic ornithischians. Its large hands resembled those of the Heterodontosauridae, a clade of primitive ornithischians. The morphology of the triangular teeth, not unlike those of an iguana, suggests partial herbivory. The tibia was significantly longer than the femur, indicating it was a swift runner. Leelanasaura is a small dinosaur, about 90 centimeters in length. It is known from several specimens, including 2 nearly complete skeletons and 2 fragmentary skulls. Hearn argued that it lacked ossified tendons in its tail. The tail is among the longest relative to its body size of any ornithischian, being 3 times as long as the rest of the body combined. Leelanasaura was an Australian polar dinosaur, living within the Antarctic Circle during the mid-Cretaceous. Although it was warmer during this period, it is possible that the sun might not have risen for several weeks or months in the winter, which means that Leelanasaura would have had to live in the dark for perhaps months at a time. A skull fragment suggested it had large eyes and optic lobes, indicating adaptation to low-light conditions. However, the large orbits might instead represent the eyes of a juvenile rather than an adaptation to darkness. The eyes of Heterodontosaurus were known to be larger in younger animals, which became proportionally smaller as it got older, perhaps to make young animals appear cute and thus inspire parental instincts, indicating some form of parental care was probably present. However, the teeth did not change as it grew, indicating the diet of young individuals was the same as older ones. It had a keratinous beak at the front of its jaws and canine-like tusks in its jaws which had heavy coats of enamel, arranged in asymmetrical patterns. Tusks are known in almost all skulls of Heterodontosaurus, indicating that the tusks did not differ between the sexes and were not a sexually dimorphic feature. It was a bipedal runner and endothermic, with a mostly herbivorous diet, as the horny beak and specialized teeth were much more similar to those adapted for cutting off vegetation. Furtadens is the smallest known ornithischian, measuring about 65 to 75 centimeters long, and potentially omnivorous with unique peg-like teeth. Known from 4 individuals, it may have lived in small groups and possibly had feather coverings like other early ornithischians. Furtadens inhabited a floodplain environment alongside various organisms, including fish and crocodilomorphs. It likely occupied a generalist niche, different from the more specialized ornithopods and neornithischians. A 2012 study of the skull suggested its diet was composed of select plant material and possibly insects or other invertebrates. This small dinosaur lived in the Morrison Formation, among many larger sauropods. Tyanulong, found in Jianchong County, lived during the Oxfordian age of the late Jurassic. As a heterodontosaurid, it had varied teeth suggesting an omnivorous diet. The fossil preserves filamentous structures on the neck, back, and tail, which are hollow and unbranched, similar to those on Stegosaurus and some theropods. These structures are about 60 mm long, much taller than a caudal vertebra, and are not subdermal collagen fibers. Their discovery in Tyanulong extends the presence of such structures further down the phylogenetic tree, although their homology with theropod protofeathers is uncertain. If homologous, it implies the common ancestor of saurischians and ornithischians had feather-like structures. If not, it suggests these structures evolved independently in both groups. A study in Biology Letters supports the hypothesis that scales are plesiomorphic to dinosaurs, not protofeathers. Lecythosaurus is well documented due to the high quality and quantity of its specimens, providing detailed anatomical information. This lightly built, bipedal dinosaur measured between 1 to 2 meters in length and was one of the earliest ornithischians. Its long legs and slender tail suggest it was a fast runner, but its small arms were not suited for grasping. Lecythosaurus had a beak-like structure at the tips of its jaws, followed by leaf-shaped teeth, and its premaxillary teeth were slender and curved. Analysis indicates it sliced food with its beak and did not chew, leading to less tooth abrasion and suggesting an opportunistic omnivorous diet. The small, narrow skull had large eye sockets and cavities for jaw muscles, with a blade-like predentary bone hinting at a small beak. The distinctive armored ankylosaurs and stegosaurs were very closely related to each other, and were part of a group of dinosaurs known as the Thyreophorans. One of the earliest known members of this lineage was Scutellosaurus. It was a small lightly built bipedal herbivore, only about 1.2 meters long, with over half that length being just its unusually long tail. Its body was covered in rows of hundreds of small bony osteoderms, helping to protect it against larger predators like Dilophosaurus. And this was obviously an evolutionary strategy that worked very well for Scutellosaurus and other early Thyreophorans, because within about 20 million years they'd given rise to the first true ankylosaurs and stegosaurs, with the tank-like ankylosaurs being especially successful, spreading to every continent and lasting all the way up until the end Cretaceous mass extinction. Emosaurus had a sinuous jaw profile, more advanced than the rectilinear morphology of the basal genus Scutellosaurus, reflecting dietary evolution. It was likely adapted to eat coriaceous flora such as bennetites and cycads. The rest of its skeleton is poorly represented, with vertebrae showing no significant changes seen in stegosaurs. Emosaurus was covered in osteoderms, though their full distribution is unknown. Its forelimb adaptations and conical ungual phalanges suggest it was a weight-supporting quadruped, though pseudobipedality is possible for reaching taller flora. Later studies caution against inferring bipedality or quadrupedality due to the taxon's incomplete remains. Larger and potentially quadrupedal, Solidosaurus was also capable of bipedal locomotion, as indicated by trackways, possibly similar to a pangolin's movement. Measuring about 4 meters in length, it lived between 196 and 183 million years ago during the early Jurassic, specifically from the Sinemurian to Pliensbachian ages, and is known from multiple formations in England. It had a small, flattened skull, a relatively short tail, and several rows of osteoderms along its body. Covered in scales and osteoderms, Solidosaurus had a fairly large belly. One of the oldest known and most primitive of the Thyreophorans, the exact placement of Solidosaurus within this group has been the subject of debate for nearly 150 years. This was not helped by the limited additional knowledge about the early evolution of armored dinosaurs. Today most evidence suggests that Solidosaurus is the most derived of the known basal Thyreophorans, either closely related to Ankylosauria and Stegosauria. As an herbivore, it had simple teeth for cropping low, scrubby vegetation and a narrow head, similar to later stegosaurs. Just 1.5 meters long, Jacopil lived in what is now southern Argentina, in an ancient desert with a braided river system. It was bipedal, with a short beak, small arms, and a body bristling with spiky armor, and its unusually deep lower jaw and heavily worn teeth indicate it fed on rather tough vegetation that required a lot of chewing to process. It's currently only known from somewhat fragmentary remains, so reconstructions of its full appearance are rather speculative, and there's already been some dispute about whether Jacopil actually was a Thyreophoran. One proposal is that it shared a lot of anatomical features with early ceratopsians instead, which if true would make it an incredibly weird armored ceratopsian, and also the first definitive member of that group from South America. But the ceratopsian-like features could also just be due to convergent evolution, and a jacopil-like dinosaur might actually help explain the only other known dubious South American ceratopsian Notoceratops, and the similarly disputed Australian Serendipasseratops. Huayangosaurus had several types of osteoderms. On its neck, back and tail were 2 rows of paired small vertical plates and spikes. On the rear of the tail, pairs of spikes were present forming the so-called thagomizer, a defensive weapon. Each flank had a row of smaller osteoderms, culminating in a long shoulder spine in front, curving to the rear. Huayangosaurus was one of the smallest known stegosaurians, at just 4 meters in length and 500 kilograms in body mass. Its plates were smaller than those of Stegosaurus, with much less surface area. Thus, they would have been much less effective heat regulators, one of the postulated functions of plates. It is also morphologically distinct from later, stegosaurid forms. Its skull was broader and had premaxillary teeth in the front of its mouth. All later stegosaurians lost these teeth. Tujiangosaurus was a medium-sized stegosaur, measuring about 7 meters long and 2 meters tall, with a long neck, small head, and armor along its back. It was quadrupedal with a flexible tail and had distinctive small, sharp, triangular plates along its back, which varied in size. The dinosaur's long legs provided decent mobility for a bulky quadruped, and its small beak allowed it to specialize in browsing medium-level vegetation. It likely had a primarily scaly body, possibly with some feathers for display, and could flush its plates with color. Its defensive structures included a thagomizer, like all other stegosaurs, for protection against predators, and fossil evidence suggests it effectively used this for defense. Display features like plates and shoulder spikes indicate Tujiangosaurus was an active, social animal, likely communicating through visual signals and sound within its herd. Gigantospinosaurus, described as a medium-sized stegosaur, was estimated to be about 4 meters long and weighed 700 kilograms. It had a distinctive appearance with small dorsal plates and greatly enlarged shoulder spines, which were twice the length of the shoulder blades. The neck plates were small and triangular, and the head was relatively large with 30 teeth in each lower jaw. Its hips were very broad, and the low neural spines of the sacral vertebrae and the first tail vertebra were fused into a single plate, with robust forelimbs. Skin impressions revealed a pattern of rosettes with central pentagonal or hexagonal scales surrounded by smaller ridged scales. A study indicated that Gigantospinosaurus is the most basal known member of the Stegosauria, sharing basal traits with Huayangosaurids and more advanced traits with other stegosaurs. In an ontogenetic histological analysis of stegosaur plates and spikes, Hayashi examined their structure and function from juveniles to old adults. They discovered that the dorsal osteoderms are composed of dense ossified collagen fibers, indicating that plates and spikes form from the direct mineralization of fibrous networks in the skin. The structural features of spikes and plates develop at different stages, with extensive vascular networks forming in plates during the juvenile to young adult transition, supporting their growth for attracting mates and deterring rivals. The vascular networks in young adult plates also suggest a secondary function as thermoregulatory devices. In old adults, spikes develop a thick cortex and large axial vascular channels, indicating their use as defensive weapons at a late stage. Plates, however, do not show similar bone compaction or cortical thickening, suggesting they were less important in active defense. Mancanosaurus is a dubious genus of stegosaur from the Lura Formation of Tibet, making it a rare non-avian dinosaur known from that region. It is uncertain exactly when it lived, though it may have lived in the early Cretaceous, around 145 million years ago. It originally didn't have a formal description or species name, which was only rectified 4 years later with a formal description of the partial skeleton, lacking a skull. It was probably about 5 meters long, and may have been a stegosaurid, or a derived stegosaur. A digital articulation and manipulation of digital scans of specimen material of Kentrosaurus inferred that stegosaurids may have used an erect limb posture, like that of most mammals, for habitual locomotion while using a sprawled crocodilian pose for defensive behavior. The sprawled pose would allow them to tolerate the large lateral forces used in swinging the spiked tail against predators as a clubbing device. Kentrosaurus was a small stegosaur. It had the typical dinosaurian body plan, characterized by a small head, a long neck, short forelimbs and long hind limbs, and a long, horizontal and muscular tail. Typical stegosaurid traits included the elongation and flatness of the head, the powerful build of the forelimbs, erect and pillar-like hind limbs, and an array of plates and spikes running along both sides of the top midline of the animal. One hypothesis on stegosaurid diet holds that they were low-level browsers, eating foliage and low-growing fruit from various non-flowering plants. Kentrosaurus was capable of eating at heights of up to 1.7 meters when on all fours. It may also have been possible for it to rear up on its hind legs to reach vegetation higher in trees. Loricatosaurus is known from two partial skeletons, which do not actually include a shoulder spine, as has popularly been attributed, though it was speculatively given one here. It was found in the Marnes à Belemnopsis latisulcatus formation in France, as well as the Oxford Clay Formation in England, dating back to the Colovian age of the Middle Jurassic, around 164 million years ago. The material it is known from is rather poor, however, and it is difficult to say more about this genus. It seems to be a small stegosaur, maybe because of insular dwarfism. Dacentrurus was one of the largest stegosaurs, estimated to reach 9 meters in length and weigh 5 to 7 tons. It had a broad gut and wide dorsal vertebrae, with relatively short hind limbs and long forelimbs due to an extended upper arm. The neck consisted of 12 vertebrae, and the dorsal and front tail vertebrae were massively built. Its armor included small, thick-based plates along the back and several pairs of tail spines, including the thagomizer. Skin impressions revealed scales with central pentagonal or hexagonal patterns surrounded by smaller scales. Initially thought to have shoulder spikes, recent interpretations suggest these spines were more likely located on the tail base. Dacentrurus shares with other Dacentrurinae the presence of large olecranon horns on the ulni. Combined with large deltoid crests on the humerus, they suggest a powerful musculus deltoideus, making a strong humeral flexion and abduction possible. The forelimbs could then be firmly anchored on the ground while the tail was forcefully swept from side to side, allowing the thagomizer to defend against large theropod predators. Genasauria was a medium-sized stegosaur, reaching 6 meters in length and 2.5 tons in body mass. It had 3 distinguishing traits: symmetrical teeth crowns wider than tall, a rectangular spine on the second neck vertebra, and large vein openings in the rear neck vertebrae. The skull was elongated with at least 14 teeth in the maxilla and no clear foramen paraquadraticum. The predentary had a deep hooked chin, and the lower jaw bore 21 symmetrical, triangular teeth. The neck vertebrae had large vein openings and the second vertebra had a rectangular spine. 2 neck plates, diamond-shaped and slightly taller than wide, were positioned to the right of the neural spines, indicating 2 rows. Miragea was a relatively lightweight stegosaur, reaching 6 meters in length and weighing around 2 tons. The holotype specimen showed skeletal maturity at 21 to 25 years old. It had 6 distinguishing traits, including at least 17 cervical vertebrae and unique neural spine features. The most notable feature was its long neck, which had more vertebrae than most sauropods, challenging the traditional view of stegosaurs as low browsers. This neck elongation likely resulted from incorporating back vertebrae into the neck, rather than adding new vertebrae. The authors suggested the long neck allowed Myrigea to browse at different heights or arose due to sexual selection. Genetic mechanisms, with fewer Hox genes regulating vertebral development, may have contributed to this evolutionary plasticity. In 2024, some paleontologists examined the tail resistance, suggesting that its tail can achieve high speed and significant pressures, which would inflict predators by generating high-speed strikes. Stegosaurs are some of the most popular and recognizable dinosaurs thanks to their unique appearances, with small heads, elaborate backplates, and spiky thagomizer tails. While they lasted until at least the mid-Cretaceous, their heyday was in the latter half of the Jurassic. Hesperosaurus was closely related to Stegosaurus but was a little older and a little smaller, about 6 meters long. Much like its more famous relative, its plates seem to have alternated along its back, which may have been an adaptation to maximize visible surface area while minimizing the number of plates, saving on the energy needed to grow such large elaborate ornamentation. Hesperosaurus might also represent a rare case of possible sexual dimorphism in non-avian dinosaurs, with wider, more rounded plates potentially interpreted as belonging to males and taller pointed plates belonging to females. Stegosaurus is one of the most famous dinosaurs with its double row of large, bony plates along its back and the thagomizer. It had a relatively small brain for its body size. Despite its large body, the brain was about the size of a walnut, leading to the misconception that it was unintelligent. However, brain size doesn't necessarily correlate directly with intelligence in dinosaurs. It had small, leaf-shaped teeth that were not well suited for chewing tough plant material. It likely fed on low-lying plants, such as ferns and cycads, cropping vegetation rather than grinding it. Ontogenetic studies reveal that its plates and spikes developed differently as it aged. Juvenile Stegosaurus had smaller and less pronounced plates and spikes compared to fully grown adults. The arrangement and size of the plates may have also played a role in social behavior and communication. It's speculated that the plates could have been used for display purposes to attract mates or intimidate rivals. The tail of Stegosaurus was relatively flexible and muscular, allowing for swift movements. This flexibility was crucial for the effective use of the thagomizer in defense. Trace fossils, such as trackways, suggest that Stegosaurus might have lived in herds or family groups. Group living could have provided better protection against predators. Stegosaurus has left a significant mark on popular culture. It was one of the first dinosaurs to be depicted in movies and literature and remains a staple in dinosaur-related media, highlighting its lasting impact on public imagination. Wierosaurus was probably a broad-bodied animal, reaching 7 meters in length and 4 tons in body mass. Only a few scattered bones have been found, making a full restoration difficult. Its dorsal plates were at first thought to have been much rounder or flatter than other stegosaurids, but Maidment established this was an illusion caused by breakage. Their actual form is unknown. Wierosaurus had a pelvis of which the front of the ilia strongly flared outwards, indicating a very broad belly. The neural spines on the tail base were exceptionally tall. It was lower to the ground than most other stegosaurids. Scientists believe that this was an adaptation to let it feed on low-growing vegetation.